And Catherine Park is going to help with questions. And we have Carl Scala, who's sitting right here, a former city council member and on the Planning and Zoning Board, who will give us some information and answer questions as needed. We are taping for YouTube, so when you go to the microphone and ask your questions, your voice, perhaps your image might show up on YouTube, just so you know what we're doing. You have information sheets to keep and a blue card, which is for writing down a question. You'll have an opportunity to ask the question yourself. Please be as brief as you can so we can get a lot of questions in. We have to end our meeting a little after 8:30 as the library closes at 9. Okay, we are here to ask, are enhanced enterprise zones, or EEZs, and a blight label good for Columbia? Briefly, here's what has happened so far. EEZs were first passed by the Columbia City Council by resolution in February. A citizens group, CiViC, Citizens Involved and Invested in Columbia, was formed to protest EEZs, and a citizens petition was started by CiViC to rescind the EEZ resolution as being improper according to city charter. The city attorney decided it should indeed be rescinded, which it was. However, it was quickly reintroduced as an ordinance and rushed to the city council again, passing unanimously on May 21st. Thus, an EEZ board was officially reestablished. We have many questions about EEZs and blight, such as, should large parts of Columbia be legally designated as blighted to qualify corporations to locate in EEZs, where they then become eligible for corporate tax write-offs? Why has no data been given to show this is a good way to provide jobs? Will EEZs cut our city's tax base, leaving less funding for schools, libraries, police, and fire departments and other community needs? Also, EEZs transfer control to the state of Missouri. How would Columbia be affected by this loss of local control within an EEZ? And if cities continue to blight themselves and erode their tax base for EEZs, what are the long-term consequences for the state of Missouri and for this nation? These are just a few of the critical questions which remain unanswered. To provide us some of these answers, we have invited our speaker, Mr. Greg LeRoy, Executive Director of Good Jobs First, based in Washington, D.C. Good Jobs First is a nonprofit group which promotes corporate and government accountability in economic development. Mr. LeRoy has been working in this field for over 25 years and has been called the leading national watchdog of state and local economic development subsidies. He recently testified to the Missouri House Economic Development Committee, and he is the author of the book, The Great American Jobs Scam, Corporate Tax Dodging, and the Myth of Job Creation. Mr. LeRoy will speak for about 20 minutes, and then we'll take questions. Mr. Greg LeRoy.
Thank you very much, Linda. It's really good to be there tonight. I love this webcam. You're saving me a little bit of wear and tear of travel. I actually had a drive-by look at Columbia sort of accidentally last month on my way to Jefferson City. The driver who picked me up, we got talking. Columbia on the way to get turned south. So, are people hearing me okay? Yeah. I just got a signal here that there's an internet connection problem. Is that okay now?
Yeah.
Okay. So I want to really thank the sponsors for putting this meeting together tonight. All the sponsoring organizations and people for coming out tonight. You have a right to participate in this decision. There's a lot of money involved here. There's a lot about the future of your community involved here. This is not a partisan issue, and frankly, although some people might have you believe it's a complicated issue, at its core, these economic development programs like enhanced enterprise zones are not rocket science. And if anybody tries to buffalo you and make you think that you can't understand them or you don't have the ability to participate because you just don't get it, shame on them. You can get your head around these programs, and some of the basic things that apply that I'm going to talk about are basic common sense. So let's get into it. Let's talk about these programs and what's going on with them. The Enhanced Enterprise Zone program is a state-enabled program, right? It's created under state legislation, which then sets up two different kinds of tax breaks for companies that qualify for the deal. And companies qualify for the deal by creating a small number of jobs or investing a certain number of dollars minimum. They get two kinds of tax breaks for doing that. They get a series, they're eligible for state tax credits up to $500,000 worth against their state income tax or payroll tax. And they're also eligible then to receive a 50% property tax break, a property tax abatement on all the increased property value. That is, if they build a new building or build a new wing and therefore have a higher property tax bill, they get a 50% tax abatement or break on that new assessment for 10 years. And under state law, the property tax abatement can actually be increased. It's a local option, can be increased to 100% for 25 years. That's not automatic, it has to be enabled locally, but it's legal under the state law. So, and even though the state caps the amount of money it can spend on this program every year at $24 million, there are no caps about how much money local governments can lose via the property tax abatement tax break. So that's an important thing to understand. And as you'll hear from the other speaker, and I'll mention briefly later, the blight designation is a state prerequisite again for inclusion in the zones. But let's talk about the way the program's already working and why I don't think enterprise zones generally, including your enhanced enterprise zone programs, are really effective. If we're really trying to fix what's broke, let's get real. And here's what I'd say. If you look, first of all, at which companies are using the program already, and you can get that information from a database on the front page of our website, something called Subsidy Tracker, where we've actually downloaded all of the Missouri data on companies that have received the Enhanced Enterprise Zone state tax credits. We don't have the local property tax data, but we have the state tax credit data on our website. And you look at the list of the biggest recipients, the companies that have either maxed out at $500,000 or gotten $300,000-$400,000 already. And it's really dominated mostly by food processing companies and biofuel companies. Companies like Cargill, Ag Processing, Show Me Ethanol, Lifeline Foods, Conagra, General Mills, Nestle Purina. They're all prominent, high on the list of companies that have claimed these credits so far. I look at that list and I say, come on, Missouri is an agricultural state, so of course you're going to have a lot of food processing and biofuel production there. That's where it has to get processed and made. You're not going to lose that. Those jobs aren't going offshore. They've got to be where the ag production is, frankly. So far anyway, it looks like the program is mostly benefiting big ag processing and biofuel companies. I don't know what the condition of those companies is in your city, but that's where the dominant dollars are going so far. I'd like to talk about structural problems with enterprise zones, including your EPC program. And I apologize, I've got some notes carelessly propped up on the top of my monitor here so I can look at you while I'm talking, and it's not cooperating. The first problem with enterprise zones is that they create windfalls to companies. It's not targeted, right? When you create a big zone, I guess the original proposed zone there was roughly half the entire city, you're necessarily going to create a windfall for a bunch of companies that didn't know they were there, didn't ask for it, are just getting something that just sort of fell out of the sky because they happen to be included in the geographic boundaries of the zone. So you're immediately then spending money if those companies qualify to get the credits, but you're not changing companies' behavior. You're not, when you do something that's a windfall companies didn't even know about or ask for, obviously you can't credibly claim that you caused them to hire people or caused them to invest. Causation is really not there. Another structural problem is that you run the risk of creating an unlevel playing field. That is, you may end up with competing companies in the same market, one company in the zone, one company outside the zone, and the company inside the zone has the I would say, unfair advantage then of an unlevel playing field of getting these tax credits from the state and these property tax abatements from the city and having a leg up. So you'd be creating an unfair situation between two competing, similarly situated companies. Another big problem, frankly, with enterprise zones is that they just don't work. I mean, that's a big structural issue here. And that's the recurring thing you see in scholarship and studies on them. That is, even people who defend them in the name, say, of urban revitalization or helping revitalize depressed areas, they say, they'll be honest and say, they don't create net new jobs for the metropolitan area. They just move economic activity around. But at least we're steering jobs into areas that are hurting, that are depressed and have high unemployment or high poverty or high dilapidation or whatever the criteria are. And therefore, that's a justifiable use of the subsidy to help those areas. Well, that justification might work if the zones were really tight, if they really encompassed small places, small parts of cities, and truly tightly defined areas that were genuinely distressed. But when you have a zone that spans half a city, or other cities that have mini zones, dozens of zones, or TIF districts, or other of these special tax districts that states enable them to have, that whole argument breaks down. You've deregulated the programs to the point where, as we said in a study 9 years ago, they're straying from good intentions. They sound good on their face. Everybody wants to help revitalize depressed areas. That sounds great. But when you write the rules and enables the special tax zones or enterprise zones or TIF districts to go almost anywhere and to capture areas that are not hurting or not needy or quite affluent, and then divert that revenue into development rather than to the general fund for public services, you're not really helping the depressed areas anymore, but you're costing public services a great deal of money. Another reason why many tax breaks for economic development, including kind of blunt, badly targeted ones like enterprise zones, don't work, is because they can't. And here's why I say they can't. All state and local taxes combined as a cost of doing business for the average company in America, that is, on their balance sheet, all the things they spend money on, all state and local taxes combined come to just over 1% of their total cost structure. Which is to say, the business basics, the things that are big cost items, labor, occupancy, materials, logistics, energy, whatever it is a company uses or buys a lot of to make or do what it produces or sells, those are the business basics. Tiny, tiny changes in cost of labor or occupancy or logistics or energy would dwarf anything you can do with the tax code. If you're talking about giving a company a tax break, you're talking about giving them, shaving off some fraction of 1% of their cost structure. You just can't move the needle very much. You can't influence companies' decisions very often at that tiny degree of difference. There's rarely ties that involve such a minute fraction of a company's cost structure. There's only one thing you can say for sure about the outcome of an enterprise zone, and that's going to cost a lot of money. We know it's capped at $24 million at the state level, and then it's not capped in terms of how much property tax revenue or for how many years you could lose it locally. Another big risk, frankly, in undermining your property tax base is this. We know right now, in your state like others, the state is cutting back on aid to local government and cutting back on aid to school districts, right? Lots of states are doing that because of their budget tightening that they've been forced to do during the recession. That means that the other revenue that you have, including property tax revenues, which is typically your largest source of revenue for local public services, is more important than ever. So if you undermine that local property tax base in the name of economic development, you run the risk of undermining those things that really do matter for economic development. And by that I mean, we know from the long-term literature that the things that really do work, that do pay off long-term for job creation and income growth in America are growing your skills base and having modern, efficient infrastructure. If you undermine your schools and your community colleges and your other educational institutions, or you undermine your ability to maintain efficient, productive infrastructure, and you do that in the name of economic development, it's really perverse. You'd be shooting yourself in the foot. And so it's really important to be mindful about the impact of EEZs or any other program on your local property tax base. And then there's this risk, the specific issue of blight in Missouri, which is a very troubled long-term issue, not a new issue at all in terms of the way it's played out in Missouri. The way I'm most familiar with it is regarding the tax increment financing program there. And there's a passage in my book where I ridicule an affluent suburb of St. Louis called De Pere, which blighted a mall, a very upscale mall, because it didn't have a Nordstrom. And it was blighted, and they gave the developers $31 million to bring in a Nordstrom so that the upscale mall would no longer be blighted. That blight designation was upheld all the way at the highest court in your state. There's also a great book written about the history of failure of redevelopment, including the blight designation in St. Louis by a terrific historian named Colin Gordon. It's called Mapping Decline, St. Louis and the Future of the American City. I'd recommend that to you as well. But suffice it to say that history of the blight designation in Missouri, and I understand there may be some particulars even historically in your city as well, but certainly it's a troubled history in Missouri and not something to be taken lightly. I'd like to finish by talking about a positive alternative to enterprise zones, or enhanced enterprise zones. I backed into this issue accidentally as a plant closing activist. I lived in Chicago for 25 years and out of the Midwest for much of that time. I created a consulting practice at a nonprofit organization, helping communities and unions and community groups and church groups and others try to prevent factory closings, starting in the mid-'80s through the mid-'90s. And I spent a lot of time working on the causes of plant closings. In fact, I wrote something called the Early Warning Manual Against Plant Closings in 1986, and I trained all 50 states governments on the methodology of that manual under a contract of the U.S. Department of Labor in 1989. It was based on many autopsies we had done, that is, going back and reconstructing the history of a factory during its final years to figure out what were the things that might have been noticed and might have been paid more attention to so that people could try to avert the shutdown, to intervene in time before the plant was too far gone. You know, why plants close is complicated. There's no one-size-fits-all answer to that question. Sometimes family-owned plants that are very productive and very competitive close simply because there's an aging owner who fails to plan for the day he can no longer run the company. Sometimes very good plants are owned by companies that don't care about the particular product made there. Maybe it's a marginal product or a peripheral product, or the company gets bought out in a leverage buyout and there's too much debt and they have to sell off the plant to settle the debt. We certainly know about all the problems with Wall Street and leverage buyouts and private equity. No people are strangers to that. We know some companies close because of unfair trade competition. And frankly, we do have a trade policy problem in this country, but you can't fix trade policy with property taxes. You got to fix trade policy in Washington, D.C. Because if a company can get huge savings on labor by running off to a low-wage market, the amount of money it's saving doing that dwarfs anything looking like their tax bill. You could never tilt the scales against a runaway shop like that with a property tax break or a state income tax credit. So, you know, I would just challenge the local officials there. It's sad to hear that you've had factory job loss. I'm very sympathetic to that. I believe manufacturing is a vital part of the future American economy. We need it. It's part of vital middle class jobs, vital to American productivity and competitiveness. I would challenge your local leaders there to go back as best they can and reconstruct the history of the factories that you've lost and ask the question, why did they close? What were the particular reasons that happened here? What lessons can we draw, composting those experiences, if you will, about why those factories closed and what we can do in the future to prevent similar stories from unfolding at the factories we still have? And then actively monitoring, setting up an early warning system, a visitation system, an active monitoring, proactive monitoring system, looking at the needs of the companies that are there now. Do they need help with export assistance? Do they need help with quality control? Do they need help with healthcare procurement? Do they need help with technology adoption? Those are all real issues often, and certainly for smaller companies that have the chances of growing a lot, they often lack the management capacity to grapple with some of those needs. There's a strategy in economic development called clusters. That is, identifying a cluster, a particular kind of product or niche in a market where you think you have a competitive advantage. And that would be another question to your local leaders there. Have they already determined what kinds of industries Columbia, Missouri already has a comparative advantages? That what industries do you already have a higher than average share of employment and production in? And why do you have those comparative advantages? And what can you do to grow those advantages, to protect them and grow them, and help promising new companies in those niches get better at what they do and hire more people? That's what would make sense. But you'll notice that that's a very different kind of program than a blunt, broad tool like an enterprise zone, which just kind of blanket throws out a bunch of tax breaks in a broad geographic zone without any particular attention to the specific needs of any one company, versus a very targeted, tailored, specific approach that really identifies what the companies need and addresses them. I'm all for spending public dollars on targeted assistance that really fixes what's broke, but that's not an enhanced enterprise zone. Thanks for your time, and I look forward to the rest of the evening talking back forth to you.
My name is Carl Scala. I'm a former city councilman and current planning and zoning commissioner. I was tapped to help out here. I'm no expert on blight per se, and I want to start out with kind of a disclaimer that although I'm a member of CiViC, what I have to say is really my own opinion here, even if it's consistent with some of the rest of the folks in the audience. Let me start off kind of where, a little closer? Is that better?
Greg, can you hear?
Can you hear?
Yes.
All right.
All right.
Let me leave off where Mr. LeRoy, or let me start off where Mr. LeRoy left off. That is, there is an entrepreneurship part, there is a retention part for businesses, and there is an attraction part. The part that the EEZ is trying to address is the attraction part. And we're putting lots of marbles in this pot to try and attract businesses here, when I submit, and most experts would tell you, that the investment is much better on the front end in terms of entrepreneurship, that is trying to create businesses here and businesses that will stay here. And that's the retention part. The EEZ part is kind of like going back in time, and we're creating kind of a race to the bottom, so to speak, with taxpayer dollars. And the dollars are the financing that's occurring is occurring because of this requisite that the state puts on this application for returning tax dollars of blight. In order to get this tax abatement and the credits, tax credits from the state, we in fact have to sign on the dotted line to the definition, as the state has defined it, of blight. And that is it's a 25-year extension of that designation in our community. And as a psychologist, I have to question the psychology of blight, not only in terms of its ability to attract businesses, because if I were a business, I would want to go somewhere that was not blighted, not a place that was blighted. Particularly if Mr. LeRoy is correct in saying that this is only 1% of the budget that they are really considering. The other thing is maybe more profound, and that is the psychological effect that blight has on our community. It certainly was the first thing that I thought about when I first heard about this EEZ proposal, even though I heard about it at a work session with the city council that I happened to be sitting in. I think that was part of the problem, and that's how CiViC, the group CiViC, started to get organized. All of a sudden they understood that something was going on, but they weren't aware of what it was that was going on. And we first set out to try and correct the process, and I'm proud to have been a part of correcting that process, getting rid of the illegal, even according to the city attorney, resolution in favor of an ordinance, even though the ordinance was the same thing. But let me start back and tell you a little bit about blight, what I know about blight. I think the first place we ought to start is maybe with the definition. The definition, according to the ordinance that the City Council passed, and also the definition that they had to agree to in order to make the application to the state, says as follows. RISMO 135.950, that's where all of this is in state statutes. Paragraph 2, blighted area. An area which, by reason of the predominance of defective or inadequate street layout, unsanitary or unsafe conditions, deterioration of site improvements, improper subdivision or obsolete platting, or the existence of conditions which endanger life or property by fire and other causes, or any combination of such factors, retards the provision of housing accommodations, or constitutes an economic or social liability, or a menace to the public health, safety, morals, or welfare in its present condition and use. And then it goes on with a few other provisions, but I'll spare you that. There has also been, so that's where we start, and that's what we have to sign when we agree to take advantage of this program, which has questionable efficacy. We don't know, and it's very difficult to get some of this information out of the state. You would think that successful information would be forthcoming if they had it. But when you try and ask questions about this, it's very difficult to get information. You're usually referred to any particular EEZ to ask questions, since they have not apparently collected this information on behalf of the program. To me, that suggests a program that's pretty questionable. All right, well, let me just get out. There was one other question. Recently, there was the state legislation to change the definition of blight. Caleb Jones sponsored a bill which passed, the amendment. He sponsored an amendment which passed. That's a good thing, I guess, although it's likely not to stand up to the Hammerschmidt rule if challenged, and it probably will be challenged. And that Hammerschmidt rule means that you can't put more than one subject on the same bill, and if you do, it's usually found unconstitutional. That may in fact be the case. The only real way to provide protection, the link between blight and eminent domain, is in fact to change the charter, the city charter. And that's a possibility, and that may be something we ought to consider. But I really, before I get too much into this, I have more questions about this than I really have answers, and you probably do as well. Let me just go through a few of these questions. I mentioned one of them. What about the effects of the psychology of blight? How does that affect our community? What about the legitimacy of using the blight designation, which everybody knows is really a lie? What does that say about the morality of our community? What are the effects of blight on residential property values? This is a hotly contested area. The data is equivocal. Some people will say it has no effect. Some people say there's a profound effect. But I asked you this question: if you this is not original. If a real estate agent had two houses and one was across the street from the other, and on one side that area was designated blighted, whether it was an EEZ or anything else, and the other was not, what would you think? Which would you choose? Would you choose to take the blighted property? I submit probably not.
I submit that blight proximity could have as much damage as the actual blight designation, and all those designations, you say across the street, or what, 5 blocks away? How many blocks will you get away from blight before you don't feel like you're influenced by blight? I mean, the idea that you can actually draw a line and blight here and not blight there.
Well, I'll get to you as soon as I finish. But you're absolutely right. It goes even further than that. I mean, rather than even drawing lines, what about the whole psychological aspect of blight, and what effect does that have on our community? It's certainly true. We'll get to your question in just a minute. I think we need the microphone to do that. Another thing about this application: why is the state using 2000 census data rather than 2010 census data? As I understand it, as it was explained to me, some of the 2010 census data is sufficiently unreliable because they have changed the survey data that they collected, that it may not support the EEZ. applications anymore. So they're inclined not to change the rules to go to the modern data, the 2010 data, and use the old data because it's likely to facilitate the application process, despite the fact that the information on the 2010 data is up to date and the 2000 data is not. And then there has been consistent criticism of tax credits in the state. The state has criticized itself for extending too many tax credits, and this is an extension of that idea. Let me just finish with a few minutes here before we start taking some questions. And this is, again, the caveat, this is my own opinion. I'm not trying to align myself with CiViC or with the other groups that are associated here. I started thinking about, so where do we go next with this? Obviously, we have now passed the ordinance. There is a new group seated, the advisory board, that will advise the city council as to how to craft this application. To the credit of the folks that participated in all of this, we now have 2 members. Supposedly, I think that will, at least they fulfill the bill to be community advocates is what I meant. They're activists too. Community activists who may help, at least provide a seat so that we know what's going on. And so here's where I think we are. We rescinded the resolution, and that's accomplished. My own personal opinion is that we should reject any manufacturing, industrial, commercial, or retail tax abatement incentive proposal that requires the definition of blight as a prerequisite for tax abatement incentives. That effectively excludes the Missouri EEZ from the local economic development incentive toolbox, as they want to call it, as well as tax increment financing based on blight. That is another disturbing trend, that this is just the first of the blight-based incentives that people are looking towards, and they're looking to expand some of the other incentives as well. And the other one, I think I mentioned before, was if we really want a protection from the blight definition, we really need to change the charter. I think I'm getting the hook for questions that people may have, and I will certainly stick around, and I'm sure Mr. LeRoy will as well, to answer questions.
Something else that was just said about the blight. So I also forgot to mention that your own state auditor did a study of the program 1.5 years ago, and she found 2 very typical problems with the program. One, that the state was failing to verify job creation claims or investment claims by the company, even though the state can easily do that. For instance, it can verify employment by looking at unemployment insurance records of the companies to see how many people they're paying unemployment insurance payroll taxes on. And they also found that in a large number of cases, the companies or the cities sponsoring the applications were using exaggerated dollar figures regarding the ripple effect, the amount being invested, or other ripple effect numbers, which then exaggerated the apparent benefits or apparent ripple effects of the deals. Those are also common problems we see with the way the programs are loosely monitored. Regarding that litany of blight definitions that was read, I'm really glad you read that great litany. That language dates back almost 100 years. It was created during the Progressive era for cities to gain the police powers to eliminate slums, basically. And it doesn't serve us well today because it's too broad. In my opinion, it's inappropriate. It's certainly have any little piece of that and claim that it's appropriate. So I'm being told there's a connection problem. Anyway, let's have questions and answers now.
One last thing we might add is that the definition for blight is the exact same definition as it is for eminent domain. Is that not correct, everyone here? That's what I understand. We are going to start a questions and answers period, and because we want everyone to be able to hear the question, we would like to have you speak very closely into the microphone. We'd like to ask you to keep your questions short and succinct so we can have as many people as possible get their questions answered, and we can have both Mr. LeRoy and Mr. Scala answering questions depending on your question and who you'd like to address it to. So if we did hand out cards, if you want to write your question down, it might be easier for you to be succinct and read it. Do we have anyone who would like to ask a question? If so, please kind of step forward because you'll have to use the mic.
Very quick question, probably for Carl. Carl, we have 7 people you mentioned on this new EEZ board that has been established by ordinance now. And my question is, are any of those people here tonight for this very important meeting?
I saw Jeremy Root here, and he is one of the community advocates on this board. Is there anyone else here that is a member of that board? Apparently not.
Just so the community knows, we did invite all of the city council members and the mayor to join us tonight. And I have seen, I don't know if he's still here, Mr. Kelly, our state representative, so we want to thank Mr. Kelly for being here tonight. So we do have at least some folks interested in this issue along with the rest of the community who represent us. We are hopefully going to have lots of questions. If not, we can certainly add other comments, but here we go. Okay.
To me, this does not sound, Mike McMillan, this does not sound like it's creating jobs, revenue. To me, it sounds like it's about control. And my question to whoever who would like it, it sure sounds like it smacks of UN Agenda 21. Any thoughts on that? Well, I don't know if I'm capable of doing that. It's basically United Nations taking control of our government through big bankers, Wall Street, and corporations. We're not the republic that our founders envisioned, and consequently we've become a corporate, global, fascist oligarchy, and basically UN Agenda 21 is controlling where we live, what we eat, all aspects of our lives, and I see this as another avenue of that.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your question, and I don't know if Carl or Mr. LeRoy or someone else who feels more knowledgeable on this might. You want to talk to this, Carl?
Just a bit.
I'm very familiar with the UN, the 21 project, so on and so forth. In my disclosure, I suppose I should have also said that I'm the chair of the Smart Growth Coalition in town. And that resolution that this is some sort of a takeover because of the language of smart growth and with the government, from my perspective, is vacuous.
And I'll just second that. I mean, the issue of sustainability is good for everybody, and it's available for anybody to apply as they wish.
Do we have any other questions or